Hello, everybody, and how are you? I hope you're well, regardless of what the weather is like outside at the moment. Here in New Zealand, it's been rainy, it's now windy, it'll probably get rainy again in a few minutes. Whatever, that's the way it happens. And this is spring, this is not winter. Anyway, what are we doing? We're reading a story. The story we're reading is written by Ouida, who's the lady who wrote. I can't remember what she wrote. My mind's gone blank. Oh my God. The one about the dog from Flanders, or in Flanders, of Flanders, a dog of Flanders, something like that. I've not read that one. But this book is called The Nürnberg Stove. And I haven't got the accents over the name the way it's written, and I'm not quite sure how to say that with the dots over the U, but that doesn't matter. Anyway, so far what we've had is there's a very poor family living in a small town, and they have, because it was found in amongst rubbish somewhere, a very, very old ceramic stove, the sort that used to be used to heat a house. Some places they're molded as sections and put together. Some places they're tiles that are assembled outside of fire bricks and things like this. This is one of the ones where it's molded as or put together and becomes one great big huge ceramic room heater, and they're beautiful. I've seen pictures of them. I think I've actually seen a few in a couple of old castles and things like that in Europe. Very, very old. Even though the story's old, the stove is even older. And the stove got sold to pay off the father's debts, and our favourite character, our main character, August, did not want it to go. He feels like it's part of the family, this stove. It's kept the family warm, it's kept the family happy because it radiates its warmth through the house. And so he wanted to do something about it. So he has followed the stove when it got sent away and climbed inside it, because it's empty now, it's not hot or anything. He's climbed inside it and hidden himself inside while it's being sent off on a train, and we're about to find out where it goes and what he does about it. It's very cold because it's the middle of winter at the moment in the story. So if you're new here, hi, I'm Jev. I read old-fashioned children's stories, and it's kind of like bedtime stories rather than audiobooks. These are what I call rough reads. I make mistakes, I read bits wrong, I say it over again, I sometimes miss a bit and have to go back. Doesn't matter. I will often interrupt myself to explain something if I think that people don't necessarily understand it, or if it's describing somewhere that I've had experience of, or something that I've had experience of, which I know a lot of people won't have done. And it's just a way of keeping it real, that these are real things. They may not be in use now, but they used to be, and that sort of stuff. I don't chat while in reading time, but I do chat in chapter breaks. So I'm thinking, because this one's a reasonably short book, that we will probably finish it today. It may actually only be a 2-day read. We had the first one last time, and I'm not sure, I'm not guaranteeing it, but this may actually be the last read that we're doing on the book, The Nürnberg Stove. We'll see. So I hope you've got something to drink to keep you hydrated, maybe even something to snack on, and somewhere comfortable to sit. And if you happen to be working and listening to me, that's okay. Just, turn the headphones up so you can listen to the story. You don't have to watch the screen or anything like that. I won't be taking a roll call, Anyway, so let's get on with it. The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. Chapter 7. The winds of early winter swept bitterly across Rosenheim, and all the vast Bavarian plain was one white sheet of snow. If there had not been whole armies of men at work, always clearing the iron rails of the snow, no trains could ever have run at all. Happily for August, the thick wrappings in which the stove was enveloped and the stoutness of its own make screened him from the cold, of which else he must have died. It was that cold. Frozen he would have been. He had still some of his loaf and a very little of his sausage. What he did begin to suffer from was thirst, and this frightened him, almost more than anything else. for Dorothea had read aloud to them one night a story of the tortures some wrecked men had endured because they could not find any water but the salt sea. It was many hours since he had last taken a drink from the wooden spout of their old pump, which brought them the sparkling ice-cold water of the hills. But, fortunately for him, the stove, having been marked and registered as fragile and valuable, was not treated quite like a mere bale of goods, and the Rosenheim station manager, who knew its consignees, resolved to send it on by a passenger train that would leave there at daybreak, instead of waiting for the appropriate goods train, I suppose. And when this train went out, in it, among the piles of luggage belonging to other travellers to Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Salzburg, was August, still undiscovered, still doubled up like a mole in the winter under the grass. Those words, fragile and valuable, had made the men lift Hirschvogel gently and with care. Hirschvogel's the family name for the stove, because it has the name of the maker, the artist who decorated it, written on it, and that name is Hirschvogel. He had begun to get used to his prison, and a little used to the incessant pounding and jumbling and rattling and shaking with which modern travel is always accompanied, though modern invention does deem itself so mightily clever. All in the dark he was, and he was terribly thirsty, but he kept feeling the earthenware sides of the Nürnberg giant and saying softly, "Take care of me, oh, take care of me, dear Hirschvogel." He did not say, "Take me back," for now that he was fairly out in the world, he wished to see a little of it. He began to think that they must have been all over the world in all this time, that the rolling and roaring and hissing and jangling had been about his ears. Shut up in the dark, he began to remember all the tales that had been told in Yule around the fire at his grandfather's good house at Dorf. Yule is Christmas season. Of gnomes and elves and subterranean terrors, and the Earl King riding on the black horse of night, and he began to sob and to tremble again, and this time did scream outright, but the steam was screaming itself so loudly that no one, had there been anyone nigh, would have heard him, and in another minute or so the train stopped with a jar and a jerk, and he in his cage could hear men crying aloud, "München, München," that's what we know as Munich. Then he knew enough of geography to know that he was in the heart of Bavaria. He had had an uncle killed in the Bayerischen Wald, that's the Bavarian forests. The Bayerischen Wald, by the Bavarian forest guards, when in the excitement of hunting a black bear he had overpassed the limits of the Tyrol frontier. So he's gone from Austria into Bavaria, which we know now of as part of Germany. In these days it was probably still a separate state, but with guarded borders, and so therefore his uncle had been killed because he had dared to cross the border. That fate of his kinsman, a gallant young chamois hunter who had taught him to handle a trigger and load a muzzle, made the very name of Bavaria a terror to August. "It's Bavaria, it is Bavaria," he sobbed to the stove, but the stove said nothing to him. It had no fire in it. A stove can no more speak without fire than a man can see without light. Give it fire and it will sing to you, tell tales to you, offer in return all the sympathy you ask. "It is Bavaria," sobbed August, for it is always a name of dread augury to the Tyroleans, by reason of those bitter struggles and midnight shots and untimely deaths which come from those meetings of Jäger and hunter in the Bayerischen Wald. But the train stopped. Munich was reached, and August, hot and cold by turns, and shaking like a little aspen leaf, felt himself once more carried out on the shoulders of men, rolled along on a truck, that's a handcart, and finally set down where he knew not, only he knew he was thirsty, so thirsty. If only he could have reached his hand out and scooped up a little snow. He thought he had been moved on this truck many miles, but in truth the stove had been only taken from the railway station to a shop in Marienplatz. Fortunately, the stove was always set upright on its 4 gilded feet, an injunction to that effect having been affixed to its written label, and on its gilded feet it stood now, in the small, dark curiosity shop of one's Hans Riffler. "I shall not unpack it until Anton comes," he heard a man's voice say, and then he heard a key grate in the lock, and by the unbroken stillness that ensued, he concluded he was alone, and ventured to peep through the straw and hay. What he saw was a small square room filled with pots and pans, pictures, carvings, old blue jugs, old steel armour, shields, daggers, Chinese idols, Vienna china, Turkish rugs, and all the art lumber and fabricated rubbish of a bric-a-brac dealer's. It seemed a wonderful place to him. But oh, was there one drop of water in it all? That was his single thought, for his tongue was parching, and his throat felt on fire, and his chest began to be dry and choked as with dust. There was not a drop of water, but there was a lattice window, grated, and beyond the window was a wide stone ledge covered in snow. August cast one look at the locked door, darted out of his hiding place, ran and opened the window, crammed the snow into his mouth again and again, and then flew back into the stove, drew the hay and straw over the place he entered by, tied the cords, and shut the brass door down on himself. He had brought some big icicles in with him, and by them his thirst was finally, if only temporarily, quenched. Then he sat in the bottom of the stove, listening intently, wide awake, and once more recovering his natural boldness. Here's a picture. I'm going to see if you can see it. I'm not sure how well. I've managed to get it so it's a little bit bigger. There he is. Okay. So, just there, that's him, and behind him is what looks like a bundle of straw standing upright, and that's the wrapping around the stove. You can't see the top of it because it's so tall. So he's over at the window. He's got the window open because windows open inwards in some places. There's bars over the window so no one can break in, and he's reaching out and getting snow and pushing it in his mouth as quickly as he can so he can get as much as he can in his mouth. August opened the window, crammed the snow into his mouth again and again. That's the caption. The thought of Dorothea kept nipping his heart and his conscience with a hard squeeze now and then, but he thought to himself, if I can take her back Hirschvogel, then how pleased she will be, and how little Gilda will clap her hands. He was not at all selfish in his love for Hirschvogel. He wanted it for them all at home, quite as much as for himself. There was at the bottom of his mind a kind of ache of shame that his father, his own father, should have stripped their hearth and sold their honour thus. A robin had been perched upon a stone griffin sculpted on a house eave near. August had felt for the crumbs of his loaf in his pocket and had thrown them on to the little bird sitting so easily on the thrown them to the little bird sitting so easily on the frozen snow. In the darkness where he was, he now heard a little song, made faint by the stove wall and the window glass that was between him and it, but still distinct and exquisitely sweet. It was the robin singing after feeding on the crumbs. August, as he heard, burst into tears. He thought of Dorothea, who had every morning thrown out some grain or some bread on the snow before the church. What use is it going there, she said, if we forget the sweetest creatures God has made? That is, going to the church. What use is it going to church if our hearts are not changed and we affect the world around us? Poor Dorothea, poor, good, tender, much burdened little soul. He thought of her till his tears ran like rain. Yet it never once occurred to him to dream of going home. Hirschvogel was here. And that's the end of that chapter. So I shall take a mouthful of water, or two. At least I don't have to dig in the snow for it. Or suck on icicles. That's uncomfortable. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but it is uncomfortable, even if it is what you need. Right, carrying on. The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. Chapter 8. Presently the key turned in the lock of the door. He heard heavy footsteps and the voice of the man who had said to his father, "You have a little mad dog, muzzle him." The voice said, "Aye, aye, you should have called me a fool. You have called me a fool many times. Now you shall see what I have gotten for you." I will try again what he's actually now saying and try not to do it all weird. The voice said, "Aye, aye, you've called me a fool many times. Now you shall see what I have gotten for 200 dirty florins. Potstausend. Never did you do such a stroke of work." I'm not sure what Potstausend is. Maybe it's the guy's name. Maybe it's a German swear. Don't know. You can look it up if you want. Then the other voice grumbled and swore, and the steps of the two men approached more closely, and the heart of the child went pitter-pat, as a mouse's does when it is on the top of a cheese and hears a housemaid's broom sweeping near. They began to strip the stove of its wrappings. That he could tell by the noise they made with the hay and the straw. Soon they had stripped it wholly. That too he knew by the oaths and exclamations of wonder and surprise and rapture which broke from the man who had not seen it before. A right royal thing, a wonderful and never to be rivalled thing, grander than the great stove of Hohensalzburg. I wonder if that's a real one. Maybe we should look that up sometime. Sublime, magnificent, matchless. Just going to write that name down. Hohen Salzburg. Sublime, magnificent, matchless. So the epithets ran on in thick guttural voices, diffusing a smell of lager beer so strong as they spoke that it reached August, crouching in his stronghold. He would know what it smells like because he has to carry it home for his father. If they should open the door of the stove, that was his frantic fear. If they should open it, it would be all over with him. They would drag him out. Most likely they would kill him, he thought, as his mother's young brother had been killed in the wold. The perspiration rolled off his forehead in his agony, but he had control enough over himself to keep quiet. And after standing by the Nürnberg master's work for nigh an hour, praising and marvelling, expatiating in lengthy German tongue, the men moved to a little distance and began talking of sums of money, and divided profits, of which discourse he could make out no meaning. All he could make out was that the name of the king came over very often in their arguments. He fancied at times they quarrelled, for they swore lustily, and their voices rose hoarse and high. But after a while they seemed to pacify each other, and agree to something, and were in great glee. And so in these merry spirits came, and slapped the luminous sides of stately Hirschvogel, and shouted to it, "Old Mumchance, you have brought us rare good luck. To think you were smoking in a silly fool of a salt baker's kitchen all these years." Then inside the stove, August jumped up with flaming cheeks and clenched hands, and was almost on the point of shouting out to them that they were the thieves and should say no evil of his father, when he remembered, just in time, that to breathe a word or make a sound was to bring ruin on himself and sever him forever from Hirschvogel. So he kept still, and the men barred the shutters of the little lattice and went out by the door, the little lattice being the window, and went out by the door, double locking it after them. He had made out from their talk that they were going to show Hirschvogel to some great person. Therefore he kept quite still and dared not move. Muffled sounds came to him through the shutters from the streets below, the rolling of wheels, the clanging of church bells, and bursts of that military music which is so seldom silent in the streets of Munich. An hour perhaps passed by. Sounds of steps on the stairs kept him in perpetual apprehension. In the intensity of his anxiety, he forgot that he was hungry, and many miles away from cheerful, old-world little Hall, that's the name of his town, lying by the clear grey river water, with the ramparts of the mountains all round. Presently the door opened again sharply. He could hear the two dealers' voices murmuring unctuous words in which honour and gratitude and many fine, long, noble titles played the chief parts. The voice of another person, more clear and refined than theirs, answered them curtly, and then, close by the Nürnberg stove, and the boy's ear, ejaculated a single "Wunderschön!" August almost lost his terror for himself in his thrill of pride at his beloved Hirschvogel being thus admired in the great city. He thought the master potter must be glad too, the master potter being Hirschvogel, the man who did it. "Wunderschön!" ejaculated the stranger a second time, then examined the stove in all its parts, reading all its mottos, gazing long on all its devices. That's the patterns, the icons of different things like crowns and things. They're referred to as devices. "It must have been made for the Emperor Maximilian," he said at last, and the poor little boy, meanwhile within, was hugged up into nothing, as children say, dreading that every moment he would open the stove. And open it truly he did, and examined the brasswork of the door. But inside it was so dark that crouching August passed unnoticed, screwed up into a ball like a hedgehog as he was. The gentleman shut, too, the door at length, without having seen anything strange inside it. He wasn't really looking to the back of the stove, he was just looking at the door system. Really, that's where the brasswork was. Marvelling at how well made it was. Without having seen anything strange inside it, and then he talked long and low with the tradesman, and as his accent was different from that which August was used to, the child could distinguish little that he said, except the name of the king and the word gulden again and again. I'm guessing that's money. After a while he went away, one of the dealers accompanying him, one of them lingering behind to bar up the shutters. Then this one also withdrew again, double-locking the door. The poor little hedgehog uncurled itself and dared to breathe aloud. What time was it? Excuse me. Just one of those, almost a burp that makes you itchy in the back of your throat. Sorry. Unnecessary information, but explaining the cough. What time was it? Late in the day, he thought, for to accompany the stranger they had lighted a lamp. He had heard the scratch of the match, and through the brass fretwork had seen the lines of light. He would have to pass the night here, that was certain. He and Hirschvogel were locked in, but at least they were together. If only he could have had something to eat. He thought with a pang of how at this hour at home they ate the sweet soup, sometimes with apples in it, from Aunt Mila's farm orchard, and sang together, and listened to Dorothea's reading of little tales, and basked in the glow and delight that had beamed on them from the great Nürnberg fire king. Oh, poor, poor little Gilda! What is she doing without dear Hirschvogel, he thought. Poor little Gilda! She had only now the black iron stove of the ugly little kitchen. Oh, how cruel of father! August could not bear to hear the dealers blame or laugh at his father, but he did feel that it had been so cruel to sell Hirschvogel. There were the mere memory of all those long winter evenings when they had all closed around it and roasted chestnuts or crab apples in it, and listened to the howling of the wind and the deep sound of the church bells, and tried very much to make each other believe that the wolves still came down from the mountains into the streets of Hall, and were that very minute growling at the house door. All this memory coming on him with the sound of the city bells and the knowledge that night drew near upon him so completely, being added to his hunger and his fear, so overcame him that he burst out crying for the 50th time since he had been inside the stove, and felt that he would starve to death, and wondered dreamily if Hirschvogel would care. Yes, he was sure Hirschvogel would care, had he not decked it all summer long with alpine roses and edelweiss and heaths, and made it sweet with thyme and honeysuckle and great garden lilies. Had he ever forgotten when Santa Claus came to make its crown of holly and ivy and wreath it all around? "Oh, shelter me, save me, take care of me," he prayed to the old Fire King, and forgot, poor little man, that he had come on this wild goose chase northward to save and take care of Hirschvogel. After a time he dropped asleep, as children can do when they weep, and little robust hill-born boys most surely do, be they where they may, falling asleep where they can. It was not very cold in this lumber room. It was tightly shut up and very full of things, and at the back of it were the hot pipes of an adjacent house, where a great deal of fuel was burnt. Moreover, August's clothes were warm ones, and his blood was young. So he was not cold, though Munich is terribly cold in the nights of December, and he slept on and on, which was a comfort to him, for he forgot his woes and his perils and his hunger for a time. And that's the end of that chapter. And I'm just going to mute my microphone so I can have a proper cough. And then I'll have a drink. No, it's a bit better. And just shift the screen slightly. Wrong way. Back to front. Doesn't matter. I do hope you found your something to drink. I don't really care what it is, but if you need water, drink water. Make sure you drink enough water every day. It helps your brain to work. Don't tell everybody I told you that, but you can get ahead of some of the others if you make sure you have enough water to drink so that your brain works really well. Because there are a lot of people who don't. Yeah. Anyway, we shall carry on. The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. Chapter 9. Midnight was once more chiming from all the brazen tongues of the city when he awoke, and all being still around him, ventured to put his head out of the brass door of the stove to see why such a strange bright light was around him. Excuse me. Oh, that didn't happen in the break. It should have. Sometimes when you're talking, it makes your nose itchy. I don't know why. It makes it buzz. A strange bright light all round him. It was a very strange and brilliant light indeed, and yet, what is perhaps still stranger, it did not frighten or amaze him, nor did what he saw alarm him either. And yet I think it would have done you or me, for what he saw was nothing less than all the bric-a-brac in motion. How odd! A big jug, an apostelkrug of Krusen, was solemnly dancing a minuet with a plump Faenza jar. Faenza is a type of Finnish. A tall Dutch clock was going through a gavotte, which is a type of dance, with a spindle-legged ancient chair. A very droll, that's amusing, porcelain figure of Littenhausen was bowing to a very stiff soldier in terracotta of Ulm. Maybe that's the uniform of Ulm for a particular section of the military, because he is a soldier. An old violin of Cremona was playing itself in a queer little shrill, plaintive music that thought itself merry, came from a painted spinet. That's like an early version, a small version of a piano, but it's a very thin sound because it doesn't have a big sounding box. So I'll read that sentence again. A queer little shrill, plaintive music that thought itself merry came from a painted spinet covered with faded roses. Some gilt Spanish leather had got up on the wall and laughed. A Dresden mirror was tripping about, crowned with flowers, and a Japanese bronze was riding along on a griffin. A slim Venetian rapier, that's a type of sword for doing duelling and stuff, had come to blows with a stout Ferrara sabre, all about a little pale-faced chit of a damsel in white Nymphenburg china, and a portly Franconian pitcher in gris-gris was calling aloud, "Oh, these Italians, always at a feud!" But nobody listened to him at all. A great number of little Dresden cups and saucers were all skipping and waltzing. The teapots, with their broad round faces, were spinning their own lids like teetotums. The high-back, gilded chairs were having a game of cards together, and a little Saxe poodle, with a blue ribbon at its throat, was running from one to the other, whilst a yellow cat of Cornelius Lachtleven's rode about on a Delft horse in blue pottery of 1489. I'm guessing that Cornelius Lachtleven was a potter who would have made that style of cat. Meanwhile, the brilliant light shed on the scene came from 3 silver candelabra, though they had no candles set up in them. And, what is the greatest miracle of all, August looked on at these mad freaks and felt no sense of wonder. He only, as he heard the violin and the spinet playing, felt an irresistible desire to dance too. No doubt his face said what he wished, for a lovely little lady, all in pink and gold and white, with powdered hair and high-heeled shoes, and all made of the very finest and fairest mason china, tripped up to him and smiled, and gave him her hand, and led him out to a minuet. And he danced it perfectly. Poor little August, in his thick, clumsy shoes, and his thick, clumsy sheepskin jacket, and his rough, homespun linen, and his broad Tyrolean hat. He must have danced it perfectly, this dance of kings and queens in days when crowns were duly honoured, for the lovely lady always smiled benignly, and never scolded him at all, and danced so divinely herself to the stately measures the spinet was playing, that August could not take his eyes off her till, their minuet ended, she sat down on her own white and gold bracket. "I am the Princess of Saxe Royale," she said to him, with a benign smile, "and you have got through that minuet very fairly." Then he ventured to say to her, "Madame, my princess, could you tell me kindly why some of the figures and furniture dance and speak, and some lie up in a corner, like lumber? It does make me curious. Is it rude to ask?" That's a good question, for it greatly puzzled him why, when some of the bric-a-brac was all full of life and motion, some was quite still and had not a single thrill in it. "My dear child," said the powdered lady, "is it possible that you do not know the reason why those silent, dull things are imitation?" This she said with so much decision that she evidently considered it a condensed but complete answer. "Imitation?" repeated Auguste timidly, not understanding. "Of course, lies, falsehoods, fabrications," said the princess in pink shoes, very vivaciously. "They only pretend to be what we are. They never wake up. How can they? No imitation ever had any soul in it yet." "Oh," said Auguste humbly, not even sure that he understood entirely yet. He looked at Hirschvogel. Surely it had a royal soul within it. Would it not wake up and speak? Oh dear, how he longed to hear the voice of his Fire King. And he began to forget that he stood by a lady who sat upon a pedestal of gold and white china, with the year 1746 cut on it, and the mason mark. "What will you be when you are a man?" said the little lady sharply, for her black eyes were quick, though her red lips were smiling. "Will you work for the Koninglich porcelain manufacturer, like my great dead Candler?" "I have never thought," said Auguste, stammering. "At least, that is, I do hope to be a painter, as was Master Augustin Hirschvogel at Nürnberg." "Bravo!" said all the real bric-a-brac in one breath, and the two Italian rapiers let off fighting to cry "Benom!" for there is not a bit of true bric-a-brac in all Europe that does not know the names of the mighty masters. Auguste felt quite pleased to have won so much applause, and grew as red as the lady's shoes with bashful contentment. "I knew all the Hirschvogel from old Veit downwards," said a fat Grey de Flandre beer jug. "I myself was made at Nürnberg." The stove of Nürnberg? And he bowed to the great stove very politely, taking off his own silver hat, lid, with a courtly sweep that he could scarcely have learned from burgomasters. The stove, however, was silent, and a sickening suspicion, for what is such heartbreak as a suspicion of what we love, came through the mind of Auguste. Was Hirschvogel only imitation? "No, no, no, no," he said to himself stoutly, though Hirschvogel never stirred, never spoke, yet would he keep all faith in it. After all their happy years together, after all the nights of warmth and joy he owed it, should he doubt his own friend and hero, whose gilt lion's feet he had kissed in his babyhood? "No, no, no, no," he said again with so much emphasis that the lady of Mason looked sharply again at him. "No," she said with pretty disdain. "No, believe me, they may pretend forever. They can never look like us. They imitate even our marks, but never can they look like the real thing. Never can they chasser the race." "How should they?" said a bronze statuette of Vicious. "They daub themselves green with verdigris, or sit out in the rain to get rusted. But green and rust are not patina. Only the ages can give that." Patina, or patina, is the grey-greening of brass and bronze things that happens through age. It's also referred to as the representation of age on the surface of other things, but that's what it comes from, that word. "And my imitations are all in primary colours, staring colours, hot as the colours of a hostelry signboard," said the lady of Mason, with a shiver. "Well, there is a Grey de Flandre over there who pretends to be a Hans Kraut, as I am," said the jug with the silver hat, pointing with his handle to a jug that lay prone on its side in a corner. "He has copied me as exactly as it is given to moderns to copy us. Almost he might be mistaken for me, but yet what a difference there is! How crude are his blues, how evidently done over the glaze are his black letters. He has tried to give himself my very twist, but what a lamentable exaggeration of that playful deviation in my lines, which in his becomes actual deformity." They sound like a bunch of snobs. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take a phone call. It may be very important. I'm back again, just answering some questions for somebody in the family who doesn't have anyone else to ask them of at the moment. How do you cook? Well, how long do you cook roast lamb? So there you go. It's half an hour for half a kilo, if you're wondering. 20 minutes to half an hour for half a kilo. Because, of course, you need to know how to do it too. I mean, if I'm going to be telling someone how to do it, I might as well tell you how to do it. And you do it at about 180 degrees Celsius. And if you want imperial instead of metric, you can look that one up online because I don't remember the numbers. Anyway, we'll carry on. But I need to find out whereabouts I got to. Thankfully, there's nothing actually wrong that I have to go and deal with. It was just a query. Oh, yes. The jug had been saying a lamentable exaggeration of that playful deviation in my lines, which in his becomes actual deformity, because someone had tried to copy the style. And look at that, said the gilt Cordovan leather, with a contemptuous glance at a broad piece of gilded leather spread out on a table. They will sell him cheek by jowl with me and give him my name. But look, I am overlaid with pure gold, beaten thin as a film, and laid on me in absolute honesty by worthy Diego de la Gorgias, worker in leather of lovely Cordova, in the blessed reign of Ferdinand the Most Christian. His gilding is 1 part gold to 11 other parts of brass and rubbish. And it has been laid on him with a brush. A brush! Pah! Of course he will be as black as a crock in a few years' time, whilst I am as bright as I was when I first was made, and unless I am burnt as my Cordova burnt its heretics, I shall shine on forever, because gold doesn't tarnish the way other metals do. They carve pear wood because it is so soft and dye it brown and call it me, said an old oak cabinet with a chuckle. That is not so painful. It does not vulgarize you so much as the cups they paint today and christen after me, said a Carl Theodor cup, subdued in hue, yet gorgeous as a jewel. Nothing can be so annoying as to see common gimcracks aping me, interposed the princess in pink shoes. They even steal my motto, though it is scripture, said a Trauerkrug of Regensburg in black and white. And my own dots they put on plain English china creatures, sighed the little white maid of Nymphenburg. And they sell hundreds and thousands of common china plates, calling them after me, and baking my saints and my legends in a muffle of today. It is blasphemy, said a stout plate of Gubbio, which, in its year of birth, had seen the face of Maestro Giorgio. That is what is so terrible in these bric-a-brac places, said the Princess of Mason. It brings one in contact with such low, imitative creatures. One really is safe nowhere nowadays, unless under glass at the Louvre or South Kensington. And they even get there, sighed the Grey de Flandre. A terrible thing happened to a dear friend of mine, a terracoot of Blasius. You know the terracoots of Blasius date from 1560. Well, he was put under glass in a museum that shall be nameless, and he found himself set next to his own imitation, born and baked yesterday, at Frankfurt. And what think you the miserable creature said to him, with a grin? Old pipe clay. That's what he called my friend. The fellow that bought me got just as much commission on me as the fellow that bought you, and that was all he thought about. All he thought about. You know, it is only public money that goes. And the horrid creature grinned again till he actually cracked himself. There is a providence above all things, even museums. Providence might have been interfered before and saved the public money Inferred, I think they mean. I'm not sure. Said the little mason lady with the pink shoes. After all, does it matter? Said a Dutch jar of Haarlem. All the shamming in the world will not make the muss. One does not like to seem so vulgarized, said the lady of Meissen angrily. My maker, the krabbetje, that's Jan Asselin, called Krabbetje, the little crab, born in 1610, and a master potter of Delft in Haarlem. And this is a footnote that's in the text, so it's not actually a footnote, which is why I'm reading it out. My maker, the Krabbetje, did not trouble his head about that, said the Haarlem jar proudly. The Krabbetje made me for the kitchen, the bright, clean, snow-white Dutch kitchen, well nigh 3 centuries ago, and now I am thought worthy the palace. Yet I wish I were at home. Yes, I wish I could see the good Dutch vrouw and the shining canals and the great green meadows dotted with the keen. Ah, if we could all go back to our makers, sighed the Gubbio plate, thinking of Giorgio Andreoli and the glad and gracious days of the Renaissance. And somehow the words touched the frolicsome souls of the dancing jars, the spinning teapots, the chairs that were playing cards, and the violin stopped its merry music with a sob, and the spinet sighed, thinking of dead hands. Even the little Saxe poodle howled for a master forever lost, and only the swords went on quarrelling and made such a clattering noise that the Japanese bronze rode at them on his monster and knocked them both right over, and they lay straight and still, looking foolish, and the little Nymphenburg maid, though she was crying, smiled and almost laughed. Then from where the great stove stood there came a solemn voice. All eyes turned upon Hirschvogel, and the heart of its little human comrade gave a great jump of joy. My friends, said that clear voice from the turret of Nürnberg finds, I have listened to all you have said. There is too much talking among the mortalities, whom one of themselves has called the windbags. Let not us be like them. I hear among men so much vain speech, so much precious breath and precious time wasted in empty boasts, foolish anger, useless reiteration, blatant argument, ignoble mouthings, that I have learned to deem speech a curse, laid on man to weaken and envenom all his undertakings. For over 200 years I have never spoken myself. You, I hear, are not so reticent. I only speak now because one of you said a beautiful thing that touched me. If we all might but go back to our makers. Ah, yes, if we might. We were made in days when even men were true creatures, and so we, the work of their hands, were true too. We, the begotten of ancient days, derive all the value in us from the fact that our makers wrought at us with zeal, with piety, with integrity, with faith, not to win fortunes or to glut a market, but to do nobly an honest thing, and create for the honour of the arts and God. I see amidst you a little human thing who loves me, and in his own ignorant, childish way loves art. Now I want him forever to remember this night, and these words, to remember that we are what we are, and precious in the eyes of the world, because centuries ago, those who were of single mind and of pure hand so created us, scorning sham and haste and counterfeit. Well do I recollect my master, Augustin Hirschvogel. He led a wise and blameless life, and wrought in loyalty and love, and made his time beautiful thereby, like one of his own rich, many-coloured church casements that hold holy tales as the sun streamed through them. Ah, yes, my friends, to go back to our masters, that would be the best that could befall us. But they are gone, and even the perishable labours of their lives outlive them. For many, many years I, once honoured of emperors, dwelt in a humble house and warmed in successive winters 3 generations of little, cold, hungry children. When I warmed them, they forgot that they were hungry. They laughed and told tales and slept at last about my feet. Then I knew that humble as had become my lot, it was one that my master would have wished for me, and I was content. Sometimes a tired woman would creep up to me and smile because she was near me, and point out my golden crown or my ruddy fruit to a baby in her arms. That was better than to stand in a great hall of a great city, cold and empty, even though wise men came to gaze and throngs of fools gaped, passing with flattering words. Where I go now I know not, but since I go from that humble house where they loved me, I shall be sad and alone. They pass so soon, those fleeting mortal lives. Only we endure, we the things that the human brain creates. We can but bless them a little as they glide by. If we have done that, we have done what our masters wished. So in us our masters, being dead, yet may speak and live. Then the voice sank away in silence, and a strange golden light that had shone on the great stove faded away. So also the light died down on the silver candelabra. A soft, pathetic melody stole gently through the room. It came from the old, old spinet that was covered with the faded roses. Then that sad, sighing music of a bygone day died too. The clocks of the city struck 6 of the morning. Day was rising over the Bayerischen Wald. August awoke with a great start and found himself lying on the bare bricks of the floor of the chamber, and all the bric-a-brac was lying quite still all around. The pretty lady of Mason was motionless on her porcelain bracket, and the little Saxe poodle was quiet at her side. He rose slowly to his feet. He was very cold, but he was not sensible of it or of the hunger that was gnawing inside his little empty entrails. He was absorbed in the wondrous sight, in the wondrous sounds that he had seen and heard. And that's the end of that chapter. And we shall have at least another chapter. I'm just going to have a quick look while I have my drink of water, because we're in a chapter break, and I'm allowed to, at how many chapters we have. The next chapter is chapter 10, and then there's one more after that. And this next chapter is not as long as the last one. That's the longest that we've had in the book. Right, and on with the story. We'll be finishing this one today. The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. Chapter 10. All was dark around him. Was it still midnight, or had morning come? Morning surely, for against the barred shutters he heard the tiny song of the robin. Tramp, tramp, too, came a heavy step up the stair. He had but a moment in which to scramble back into the interior of the great stove. Sorry, my water bottle left a drip of water on the end of my nose, and it was just starting to tickle because of the movement. He had but a moment in which to scramble back into the interior of the great stove when the door opened and the 2 dealers entered, bringing burning candles with them to see their way. Because the shutters had been closed on the window, remember? That's why the room is now dark, even though it's daytime. August was scarcely conscious of danger more than he was of cold or hunger. A marvellous sense of courage, of security, of happiness was about him like strong and gentle arms, enfolding him and lifting him upwards, upwards, upwards. Hirschvogel would defend him. The dealers undid the shutters, scaring the redbreast away, and then tramped about in their heavy boots and chattered in contented voices, and began to wrap up the stove once more in all its straw and hay and cordage. It never once occurred to them to glance inside. Why should they look inside a stove that they had bought and were about to sell again for all its glorious beauty of exterior? The child still did not feel afraid. A great exultation had come to him. He was like one lifted up by his angels. Presently the two traders called up their porters, and the stove, heedfully swathed and wrapped and tended as though it was some sick prince going on a journey, was borne on the shoulders of 6 stout Bavarians down the stairs and out of the door into the Marienplatz. Even behind all those wrappings, August felt the icy bite of the intense cold of the outer air at dawn of a winter's day in Munich. The men moved the stove with exceeding gentleness and care, so that he had often been far more roughly shaken in his big brother's arms than he was in his journey now. And though both hunger and thirst made themselves felt, being foes that will take no denial, he was still in that state of nervous exaltation which deadens all physical suffering, and is at once a cordial and an opiate. He had heard Hirschvogel speak. That was enough. The stout carriers tramped through the city, 6 of them, with the Nürnberg fire castle on their brawny shoulders, and went right across Munich to the railway station, and August, in the dark, recognized all the ugly, jangling, pounding, roaring, hissing railway noises, and thought, despite his courage and excitement, will it be a very long journey? For his stomach had at times an odd sinking sensation, and his head, sadly, often felt light and swimming. Yes, going without food that long if you're a child can make that effect on you. If it was a very, very long journey, he felt half afraid that he would be dead or something bad before the end, and Hirschvogel would be so lonely. That was what he thought about most. Not much about himself, and not much about Dorothea and the house at home. He was high-strung to high emprise, and could not look behind him. And that's a quote from something, and I'm not sure what. It's probably something we've referenced already. Whether for a long or short journey, whether for weal or woe, the stove with August still within it was once more hoisted up into a great van, but this time it was not all alone, and the 2 dealers as well as the 6 porters were all with it. He was in darkness. He, in his darkness, knew that, for he heard their voices. The train glided away over the Bavarian plains southward, and he heard the men say something of Berg and the Worm Sea, but their German was strange to him, and he could not make out what these names meant. The train rolled on with all its fume and fuss and roar of steam and stench of oil and burning coal. It had to go so quietly and slowly on account of the snow which was falling, and which had fallen all night. He might have waited till he came to the city, grumbled one man to another. What weather to stay on at Berg! But who he was that stayed on at Berg, August could not make out at all. Though the men grumbled about the state of the roads and the season, they were hilarious and well content, for they laughed often, and when they swore, did so good-humouredly, and promised their porters fine presents at New Year. And August, like a shrewd little boy as he was, who even in the secluded Inntal had learned that money is the chief mover of men's mirth, thought to himself with a terrible pang, they have sold Hirschvogel. They have sold Hirschvogel for some great sum. I'm sorry, I'm just checking my connection because that paused for a moment and it shouldn't have. Hopefully we haven't lost too much. They have sold Hirschvogel for some great sum. They have sold him already. Then his heart grew faint and sick within him, for he knew very well that he must soon die, shut up without food and water thus. And what new owner of the great fire palace, would ever permit him to dwell in it? Never mind, I will die, thought he, and Hirschvogel will know it. Perhaps you think him a very foolish little fellow, but I do not. Just remember, he's only about 9. It is always good to be loyal and ready to endure to the end. It is but an hour and a quarter that the train usually takes to pass from Munich to the Wurmsee or lake of Starnberg, which is obviously another way of saying it, Starnberg, Starnberg. There you go. But this morning the journey was much slower because the way was encumbered by snow. When it did reach Possenhofen and stop, the Nürnberg stove was lifted out once more. August could see through the fretwork of the brass door, as the stove stood upright facing the lake, that this Wurmsee was a calm and noble piece of water, of great width and low wooded banks and distant mountains, a peaceful, serene place, full of rest. I'm just checking that my computer's not about to shut down or something. No, it looks reasonable. It must be our internet connection. Oh well, we'll carry on. So this Wurmsee was a calm and noble piece of water, of great width, with low wooded banks and distant mountains, a peaceful, serene place full of rest. It was now near 10 o'clock. The sun had come forth. There was a clear grey sky hereabouts. The snow was not falling, though it lay white and smooth everywhere, down to the edge of the water, which before long would itself be ice. Before he had time to get more than a glimpse of the green gilding surface, the stove was again lifted up and placed on a large boat that was in waiting, one of those very long and huge boats which the women in these parts use as laundries and the men as timber rafts. The stove, with much labour and much expenditure of time and care, was hoisted into this, and August would have grown sick and giddy with the heaving and falling if his big brothers had not long got him used to, such tossing about, so that he was as much at ease, head as feet downward. The stove once in it safely with its guardians, the big boat moved across the lake to Leoni. There's another name to look up. Leoni. Leoni. How a little hamlet on a Bavarian lake got that Tuscan-sounding name I cannot tell, but Leoni it is. The big boat was a long time crossing. The lake here is about 3 miles broad, and these heavy barges are unwieldy and heavy to move, even though they are towed and tugged at from the shore. If we should be too late, the two dealers muttered to each other in agitation and alarm. He said 11 o'clock. Who was he? Thought August. The buyer, of course, of Hirschvogel. The slow passage across the Wurmsee was accomplished at length. The lake was placid. There was a sweet calm in the air and on the water. There was a great deal of snow in the sky, though the sun was shining and gave a solemn hush to the atmosphere. Boats and one little steamer were going up and down. In the clear frosty light, the distant mountains of Zillerthal and the Allgäu Alps were visible. Market people, cloaked and furred, went by on the water or on the banks. The deep woods of the shores were black and grey and brown. Poor August could see nothing of a scene that would have delighted him. As the stove was now set, he could only see the old worm-eaten wood of the huge barge. Presently they touched the pier at Leoni. Now, men, for a stout mile and a half. "You shall drink your reward at Christmas time," said one of the dealers to his porters, who, stout, strong men as they were, showed a disposition to grumble at their task. Encouraged by large promises, they shouldered sullenly the Nürnberg stove, grumbling again at its preposterous weight, but little dreaming that they carried within it a small, panting, trembling boy, for August began to tremble now that he was about to see the future owner of Hirschvogel. "If he look a good, kind man," he thought, "I will beg him to let me stay with it." And that's the end of that chapter, and we have one more to go. So one more drink of water. And then I shall read the last chapter. Yes. Actually, I'm going to give you a link before then in case you have to leave in a hurry. I'm going to give you the link to my, and this is for the people who are watching on Twitch, I'm giving you a link to my YouTube channel so you can go and listen to the rest of the story if you happen to miss it, the beginning of the story. But you'll have to wait 2 weeks to do that. Otherwise, you can go to my YouTube channel and start one of the other playlists there for one of the other books that we've read, if you're interested. It's a great way to actually do something that keep your mind occupied, like ironing or cooking dinner or lots of other things like that. As long as you don't mind me chattering at you occasionally. It's not quite the same as an audiobook. Anyway, there we go. Oh, and if you follow me here on Twitch or subscribe to my channel on YouTube, and on YouTube click the bell, you will be notified when I go online or post a new story, video. Go and do it. Open it up in another tab on your browser or something, but don't miss out just because you forgot to do it, okay? Don't forget to follow or subscribe, whichever system you're using. We shall carry on. The last chapter of The Nürnberg Stove by Ouida. Chapter 11. The porters began their toilsome journey and moved off from the village pier. He could see nothing, for the brass door was over his head, and all that gleamed through it was the clear grey sky, so they're carrying it long ways on their shoulders. Like you would kind of a coffin, one that you carry on your shoulders, not one that you're holding between you. That's one of the ways of carrying something very big and heavy, is you share the weight out, okay? And obviously the door of the firebox is up, pointing up to the sky, because the stove is this sort of shape and long, and then the firebox door is pointing up. And so he's lying inside it, looking at the sky. He could see nothing, for the brass door was over his head, and all that gleamed through it was the clear grey sky. He had been tilted onto his back, and if he had not been a little mountaineer, used to hanging head downwards over crevasses, and moreover seasoned to rough treatment by the hunters and guides of the hills and the salt workers in the town, he would have been made ill and sick by the bruising and shaking and many changes of position to which he had been subjected along this whole journey. The way the men took was 1.5 miles in length, but the road was heavy with snow, and the burden they bore was heavier still. The dealers cheered them on, swore at them and praised them in one breath, besought them and reiterated their splendid promises, for a clock was striking 11, and they had been ordered to reach their destination at that hour. And though the air was so cold, the heat drops rolled off their foreheads as they walked. They were so frightened at being late, but the porters would not budge a foot quicker than they chose, and as they were not poor 4-footed carriers, their employers dare not thrash them, though most willingly would they have done so. The road seemed terribly long to the anxious tradesmen, to the plotting porters, to the poor little man inside the stove, as he kept sinking and rising with each of their steps. Where they were going he had no idea. Only after a very long time he lost the sense of the fresh icy wind blowing on his face through the brasswork above, and felt by their movements beneath him that they were mounting steps or stairs. Then he heard a great many different voices, but he could not understand what was being said. He felt that his bearers paused some time, then moved on and on again. Their feet went so softly he thought they must be moving on carpet. And as he felt a warm air come to him, he concluded that he was in some heated chambers, for he was a clever little fellow and could put two and two together, though he was so hungry and so thirsty, and his empty stomach felt so strangely. They must have gone, he thought, through some very great number of rooms, for they walked so long on and on and on. At last the stove was set down, and happily for him, set so that his feet were downward. Well, yes, of course. What he fancied was that he was in some museum like that which he had seen in the city of Innsbruck. The voices he heard were very hushed, and the steps seemed to go away, far away, leaving him alone with Hirschvogel. He dared not look out, but he peeped through the brasswork, and all he could see was a big carved lion's head in ivory, with a gold crown atop it. It belonged to a velvet fauteuil, but he could not see the chair, only the ivory lion. There was a delicious fragrance in the air, a fragrance as of flowers. Only how can it be flowers, thought August. It is December. From afar off, as it seemed, there came a dreamy, exquisite music, as sweet as the spinets had been, but so much fuller, so much richer, seeming as though a chorus of angels were singing all together. August ceased to think of the museum. He thought of heaven. Are we gone to the master? He thought, remembering the words of Hirschvogel. All was so still round him, there was no sound anywhere except the sound of the far-off choral music. He did not know it, but he was in the royal castle of Berg, and the music he heard was the music of Wagner, who was playing in a distant room some of the motifs of Parsifal. Wagner was a composer who probably also, going by the story, played the music himself. For the king, maybe? By commission? Presently he heard a fresh step near him, and he heard a low voice say, close behind him, "So!" An exclamation, no doubt, he thought, of admiration and wonder at the beauty of Hirschvogel. Then the same voice said, after a long pause, during which, no doubt, as August thought, this newcomer was examining all the details of the wondrous fire tower, "It was well bought. It is exceedingly beautiful. It is most undoubtedly the work of Augustin Hirschvogel." Then the hand of the speaker turned the round handle of the brass door, and the fainting soul of the poor little prisoner within grew sick with fear. The handle turned, the door was slowly drawn open, someone bent down and looked in, and the same voice that he had heard in praise of its beauty called aloud in surprise, "What is this in it? A live child?" Then August, terrified beyond all self-control and dominated by one master passion, sprang out of the body of the stove and fell at the feet of the speaker. "Oh, let me stay, pray, mynheer, let me stay," he sobbed. "I have come all the way with Hirschvogel." Some gentlemen's hands seized him, not gently by any means, and their lips angrily muttered in his ear, "Little knave, peace, be quiet, hold your tongue, it is the king." They were about to drag him out of the august atmosphere, as if he had been some venomous, dangerous beast, come there to slay, but the voice he had heard speak of the stove said in kind accents, "Poor little child, he is very young. Let him go, let him speak to me." The word of a king is law to his courtiers. So, sorely against their wish, the angry and astonished chamberlains let August slide out of their grasp, and he stood there in his little rough sheepskin coat and his thick mud-covered boots, with his curling hair all in a tangle, in the midst of the most beautiful chamber he had ever dreamed of, and in the presence of a young man with a beautiful dark face and eyes full of dreams and fire. And the young man said to him, "My child, How came you here, hidden in this stove? Be not afraid. Tell me the truth. I am the king." Auguste, in an instinct of homage, cast his great battered black hat with the tarnished gold tassels down on the floor of the room and folded his little brown hands in supplication. He was too intensely in earnest to be in any way abashed. That's shy. He was too lifted out of himself by his love for Hirschvogel to be conscious of any awe before any earthly majesty. He was only so glad it was the king. Kings are always kind, so the Tyrolese think, who love their lords. "Oh, dear king," he said, with trembling entreaty in his faint little voice, "Hirschvogel was ours, and we have loved it all our lives. And father sold it, and when I saw that it did really go from us, then I said to myself I would go with it, and I have come all the way inside it. And last night it spoke and said beautiful things, and I do pray you to let me live with it, and I will go out every morning and cut wood for it, and you, if only you will let me stay beside it. No one ever has fed it with fuel but me since I grew big enough, and it loves me. It does indeed. It said so last night, and it said that it had been happier with us than if it were in any palace." And then his breath failed him, and as he lifted his little eager pale face to the young king's, great tears were falling down his cheeks. Now, the king likes all poetic and uncommon things, and there was that in the child's face which pleased and touched him. He motioned to his gentlemen to leave the little boy alone. "What is your name?" he asked him. "I am Auguste Streller. My father is Karl Streller. We live in Hall, in the Inntal, and Hirschvogel has been ours so long, so long." His lips quivered with a broken sob. "And have you truly travelled inside this stove all the way from Tyrol?" "Yes," said Auguste. "No one thought to look inside till you did." The king laughed. Then another view of the matter occurred to him. "Who bought the stove of your father?" he inquired. "Traders of Munich," said Auguste, who did not know that he ought not to have spoken to the king as to a simple citizen, and whose little brain was whirling and spinning dizzily round its one central idea. "What sum did they pay your father, do you know?" asked the sovereign. 200 florins, said Auguste with a great sigh of shame. "It was so much money, and he is so poor, and there are so many of us." The king turned to his gentlemen in waiting. "Did these dealers of Munich come with the stove?" He was answered in the affirmative. He desired them to be sought for and brought before him. As one of his chamberlains hastened on the errand, the monarch looked at Auguste with compassion. "You are very pale, little fellow. When did you last eat?" "I had some bread and sausage with me. Yesterday afternoon I finished it." "You would like to eat now?" "If I might have a little water I would be glad. My throat is very dry." The king had water and wine brought for him, and cake also. But Auguste, though he drank eagerly, could not swallow anything. His mind was in too great a tumult. "May I stay with Hirschvogel? May I stay?" he said with feverish agitation. "Wait a little," said the king, and asked abruptly, "What do you wish to be when you are a man?" "A painter. I wish to be what Hirschvogel was. I mean, the master that made my Hirschvogel." "I understand," said the king. Then the two dealers were brought into the sovereign's presence. They were so terribly alarmed, not being either so innocent or so ignorant as Auguste was, that they were trembling as though they were being led to the slaughter. And they were so utterly astonished, too, at a child having come all the way from Tyrol in the stove, as the gentleman of the court had just told them this child had done, that they could not tell what to say or where to look, and presented a very foolish aspect indeed. "Did you buy this Nürnberg stove of this little boy's father for 200 florins?" said the king. and his voice was no longer soft and kind as it had been when addressing the child, but very stern. "Yes, your majesty," murmured the trembling traders. "And how much did the gentleman who purchased it for me give to you?" 2,000 ducats, your majesty," muttered the dealers, frightened out of their wits, and telling the truth in their fright. The gentleman was not present. He was a trusted counsellor in art matters of the king's, and often made purchases for him. The king smiled a little and said nothing. The gentleman had made out the price to him as 11,000 ducats. So everyone's making a lot of money along the way. "You will give at once to this boy's father the 2,000 gold ducats that you received, less the 200 Austrian florins that you paid him," said the king to his humiliated and abject subjects. "You are great rogues. Be thankful you are not more greatly punished." Now, I'm going to interrupt here and say that I'm pretty certain that florins and ducats are not different names for the same thing in the two countries. I'm pretty certain that florins are like coins to us and ducats are like thousands of dollars to us. I think there's a really big difference in the monetary value of even just one of each of those things. Anyway, so he dismissed them by a sign to his courtiers, and to one of these he gave the mission of making the dealers of the Marienplatz disgorge their ill-gotten gains, making sure it went to the father. August heard and felt dazzled yet miserable. 2,000 gold Bavarian ducats for his father. Why, his father would never need to go any more to the salt baking, and yet, whether for ducats or for florins, Hirschvogel was sold just the same, and would the king let him stay with it? Would he? "Oh, do, oh, please do," he murmured, joining his little brown, weather-stained hands and kneeling down before the young monarch, who himself stood absorbed in painful thought. For the deception so basely practiced for the greedy sake of gain on him by a trusted counsellor was bitter to him. He looked down on the child, and as he did so smiled once more. "Rise up, my little man," he said in a kind voice. "Kneel only to your God. Will I let you stay with your Hirschvogel? Yes, I will. You shall stay at my court, and you shall be taught to be a painter, in oils or on porcelain as you will, and you must grow up worthily and win all the laurels at our schools of art, and when you are 21 years old you have done well and bravely, then I will give you your Nürnberg stove. Or, if I am no more living, then those who reign after me shall do so. And now go away with this gentleman, and be not afraid, and you shall light a fire every morning in Hirschvogel, but you will not need to go out and cut the wood." Then he smiled and stretched out his hand. The courtiers tried to make August understand that he ought to bow and touch it to his lips, but August could not understand that anyhow. He was too happy. He threw his 2 arms about the king's knees and kissed his feet passionately, and then he lost all sense of where he was and fainted away from hunger and tire and emotion and wondrous joy. As the darkness of his swoon closed in on him, he heard in his fancy the voice from Hirschvogel saying, "Let us be worthy of our Maker." He is only a scholar yet, but he is a happy scholar and promises to be a great man. Sometimes he goes back for a few days to Hall, where the gold ducats have made his father prosperous. In the old house room there is a large white porcelain stove of Munich, the king's gift to Dorothea and Gilda. And August never goes home without going into the great church and saying his thanks to God, who blessed his strange winter's journey in the Nürnberg stove. And as for his dream in the dealer's room that night, he will never admit that he did dream it. He still declares that he saw it all, and heard the voice of Hirschvogel. And who shall say that he did not? For what is the gift of the poet and the artist except to see the sights which others cannot see, and to hear the sounds that others cannot hear? And that's the end of the story. Isn't that a sweet little one for a fairly old one? I should probably find out when that one was written. If you wait a minute, I will do so. Just a moment. And I'm going to mute my microphone because my keyboard is very noisy. It was originally published in 1895. 2005, 2015. That means it's 126 years old, the story. The stove in the story is much older than that. Now, I've tried to find pictures of these sort of stoves to be able to show you, and I haven't been able to. I'm really, really sorry. I do have a picture of a stove similar to the one that the king sent to the family, I think, and I shall probably one day manage to get it posted into our Discord server in the channel there that is specifically for this book, because I'm setting up channels for each book. So if people want to discuss a particular book, they can. If they find pictures associated with a particular book, or photographs of locations that are in a particular book, or what in your mind's eye you see as being the sort of place that is described in a book, or what the people look like, or something like that, we can share them there in the chapter, in the channel that's specific to that book. So I'll give you the Discord server link. It probably will have to let you in, I'm not sure. I can't remember. Anyway, make yourself known over there. But it's a family-friendly place because the books I read are children's books. And so people may be visiting it with their children. So keep it seemly, please. So there's the Discord server. And I'm once again going to give you the YouTube link so you can actually subscribe to my YouTube channel and press the bell button to be notified anytime I put a new video up there. And you can also listen to the other books that I've read. So we'll see you next time. Oh, you'll want to know what book we're going to have next. It's another one from a similar part of the world. It's Heidi. You might have read it, or you might have seen a movie of it, but I'll be reading it aloud. So we'll see you next time.